All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is just social structure theories in general, but the first one we're going into, it will be social disorganization theory. So when we're looking at social structure theories in general, we look at the fact that there are these social and economic forces, particularly in lower class areas, that are majorly important determinants of criminal behavior patterns. So we're looking at stratification. We have these, at the people at the top, the people in the middle, and the people at the bottom. The people at the bottom, just like the picture depicts, they get crapped on from everybody above them. And that is what sort of leads to there being way more problems with people at the bottom, people at the in terms of socioeconomic status, people living in poverty or very close to poverty, the low socioeconomic status. So there are a lot of factors at play here, and this is at the social level, so not the individual level, and that's what these theories are all about. So the three major theories are social disorganization theory, strain theory, and cultural deviance theory when we're talking about social structure theories. So just in general, social disorganization theory, it's about the conditions within the urban environment that affect crime rates. The more social disorganization that exists, the more crime that will happen within a neighborhood, an area, city, wherever. Strain theory sees crime as a function of conflict between people's goals and their ability to legally obtain those goals. And then cultural deviance theory is about because of strain and social isolation, you have this unique lower class culture that develops with values that are at odds with conventional society. So those are kind of the three main social structure theories in a nutshell. But let's go in depth, starting with social disorganization theory. So social disorganization theory, this was Sean McKay in 1942. They basically linked crime rates to neighborhood ecological characteristics, with three major characteristics making up social disorganization. So first is economic disadvantage, strict low income, inadequate resources, that's economic disadvantage, so people living in poverty. Residential turnover is another thing that increases social disorganization. It's a characteristic of social disorganization. And this basically just means that people are moving in and out of a neighborhood, and where there's constant population turnover, people aren't really interested in investing in their communities. So the more residential turnover you have, the less you get to know your neighbors, the less you care about sort of making the area better because you're just trying to get out of it. So the more residential turnover there is, the more disorganization. And then population heterogeneity, which basically the more different people are, the less they get along and the less they work together and the less they sort of want to build a better community. So different races, different ethnicities, different languages, different backgrounds, all of these things conflict and increase isolation of people living in those areas because they don't have that community sort of working together that you have in more less socially disorganized areas, so more socially organized areas. So this is sort of a key part of social disorganization theory, is that poverty by itself is never a cause of crime. It only facilitates crime by deprivation of adequate resources to deal with crime. So that is sort of the key. It is not just poverty. Poverty is part of it, but that is never enough on its own. It only makes it so that crime is easier to happen because you don't have the resources to deal with it. So yes, it's related to crime, but poverty is not the cause of crime. And so related to where social disorganization theory kind of developed from was concentric zone theory. And so this came out, this was in 1925, Park and Burgess, and they basically said that cities grow in concentric rings. So they grow outward from the center, and each zone kind of gradually invades and dominates the adjacent zones with an overall growth outward in more or less a circle. And so the natural process, this is actually a natural process. It's one of invasion and dominance and succession, much like the way a new species of plant takes control of an ecosystem. So that's why I've got a picture of a plant there. It's an invasive species. And so it's the same idea where a plant species or an animal species or anything sort of takes over. This is a natural process, which is why this is how cities tend to develop as they're growing. And that's what Park and Burgess talked about. And so specifically because this comes from the Chicago school, they were talking about Chicago as their sort of case study. And so Chicago is made up of 5 concentric circles or zones. And there are very stable differences in the sort of the crime rates between zones. It's a very patterned. And as zones expand away from the inner city, which would be right in the sort of near the middle, then crime decreases. And so neighborhoods become wealthier, more grounded, less diverse as you are further away from that inner city area. And so that's kind of, and here's sort of what it looks like, is you have the concentric zone model. So you've got this, so what you have in the middle is the central business district. And so that is where like literally all the big businesses are, the big tall buildings where people tend to not live. There's no real residential areas there. But then just outside of that central business district, you have what's called the transitional zone. And so this is where you've got the slums, you've got deteriorated housing, factories and abandoned buildings, abandoned factories. So this is where the poor are going to live, the people who are trying to get out. So it's going to be a lot of residential turnover, and there's just whoever has to live there has to live there. So there's also going to be a lot of population heterogeneity. And so that is where crime is the highest in this transitional zone. This is also going to be where like recent immigrant groups are located, especially when they're looking at Chicago and sort of as it developed. So this is where crime is the highest. And we look at any city, and that is where crime tends to be the highest. Then right outside the transitional zone, you have the working class zone. So again, you're moving further out. So it's not as bad conditions, but it's like single family tenements. You've got like apartments and things like that, maybe some shared spaces, but it's not the poverty of the transitional zone. And so then you move out another concentric ring and you're in the residential zone now. Now this is where you've got your houses, where everybody has their own house and people have yards and garages and things like that. So it's getting to really low crime rates in this area. And then you go out to the suburbs in the commuter zone. This is the lowest crime rate because this is like where the richest people live and the biggest yards and properties and gated communities and things like that would be out in the commuter zone. And so that's our suburbs. So crime is the lowest. So you've got the central business district where you don't really have crime happen because there's people don't live there. But then as starting from the transitional zone, moving outwards, you have crime at the highest at the transitional zone and then getting lower and lower crime rates as you move farther from the central business district. So that's concentric zone theory. And so then social disorganization came from those kind of ideas. And so then a related idea is collective efficacy. And collective efficacy is, you can kind of think of it as the opposite of social disorganization. So the more collective efficacy you have in an area, the lower the amount of social disorganization. Because when you have collective efficacy, this is where you have cohesive communities that have this mutual trust, they share responsibilities, they're all working together to make the place where everybody's living better. And so they're all sort of, you have this collective group effort and people know each other, people work together, people, and not necessarily work, but like they work together at the community level to make the community better. Whether that's things like planting gardens or planting community gardens or doing block watches or just, cleaning up the area, cleaning up local parks, things like that. People are working together to make the area better. And if anybody has ever been dragon boating, you know that you have to work together to move that boat through the water. And I did that once, and it was quite the task. So in areas with high levels of collective efficacy, you're going to have high levels of various different types of control. So you have high levels of informal control because that's just things like peers and families and neighbors. And those people exert control through things like encouraging. Kids to do things or you have like, oh, I'm so disappointed in you for doing that. So that's a kind of informal control. Also, you do have sort of formal punishments. They're not really formal, but things like withholding privileges or corporal punishment. So that's still informal control. And then you have institutional control. And so this would be at the institutional level. So we're talking about things like schools and churches, businesses, social services, volunteer organizations, and they exert control in an area by giving kids something to do. So like after school programs and things like that. They also provide positive role models and positive goals that kids can be working towards. And also they give alternative sources of praise and encouragement. So you can get praise from mom and dad at home at the informal level, but you can also get praise from your teachers at school at the institutional level, let's say. And then there's also public social control, which the largest source of this is policing, but it's really any external measure to control crime. So maybe it could be aid or support from politicians or other sources of protection. Military could come into play there. But basically they exert control by having this kind of zero tolerance response to crime, as well as an overall belief that police are fair and just and that they're there for our protection. If you're in an area with low levels of collective efficacy, high levels of social disorganization, they're probably not going to be really trusting the police. They're going to, not report crimes as much because they're going to try to deal with it on their own. Maybe they think the police are not only not helpful, but maybe that they're corrupt or especially in the era of the Black Lives Matters movement, maybe they think if they call the police, they're going to get killed. So of course they're not going to do that. So when you have these low levels of collective efficacy, there's that lack of trust in the police. High levels of collective efficacy, police are there to help us, and so then they actually will call the police, and so then they feel safer, even if it doesn't actually change the safety of the area, although it does. It typically does. So in areas where you have collective efficacy is really high, then you have children are less likely to be involved with deviant peers. They're more likely to avoid deviant behavior. So it all basically just leads to less crime in an area when you have low levels of social organization and high levels of collective efficacy.